In a memo shared first to NBC News just this morning, the Biden campaign lays out its debate week strategy, which includes more than 1,500 events and a slew of TV and digital ads ahead of what's arguably the most important moment of the 2024 election cycle so far. And this comes as President Biden huddles in prep sessions with more than a dozen of his most trusted advisors at Camp David. NBC News reports that Biden's personal lawyer and former White House counsel Bob Bauer is again playing Trump in mock debate sessions. Joining us now is the communications director for the Biden-Harris 2024 campaign and the author of the debate strategy memo. Yep, that memo we were just talking about. Michael Tyler, welcome.
Michael, tell us, give us the top line of this debate strategy. What do you see as sort of the key components?
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me. Listen, I think it's pretty simple. I think it reflects what the president laid out when he challenged Donald Trump to these two debates a little over a month ago, when he said he wanted to talk to Donald Trump about the role that Trump played in overturning Roe v. Wade, why he thinks these extreme state-level abortion bans are playing out brilliantly. He wants to talk to Donald Trump about why he wants to return us to a failed economic approach that only benefits rich people like Donald Trump with corporate giveaways and tax handouts to the ultra-wealthy on the backs of the middle class. And he wants to talk about the threat that Donald Trump continues to pose to our democracy, right? Most evidently seen on January 6th, but the fact that Trump continues to sow and celebrate political violence every day out on the stump, celebrating and promising to pardon the insurrectionists of January 6th. So those are the issues that the American people are going to see on the debate stage. But fundamentally, what they're going to see is a stark choice between the president and Joe Biden, who wakes up every single day fighting relentlessly for the American people, against Donald Trump, who's now running as a convicted felon, who's only looking out for himself, does not care about the harm that he causes to the American people, so long as the end result is more power for Donald Trump. That's what the American people are going to see on the debate stage.
So, Michael, you've got Bob Bauer filling in the role of Donald Trump in the debate prep. We had the good fortune of having Bob Bauer on Andrew Mitchell talking about playing that role. Let's take a listen.
You try to give the candidate that you're working with a real feel for what it's like to be debating that particular opponent. And so you have to look at how someone like Donald Trump or whoever that might be actually performs. Sort of what are they willing to say? To be honest, it's hard to say some of the things that he says, some of which are, very fact-free. And it's hard sometimes to take on that tone just because it's, by the way, not a natural tone for me, but then you're playing a role. You're trying to make the experience as realistic for the person you're working with as possible.
It's that realism with respect to Trump that I think is going to be at play. The environment is going to be very different from 2020. Trump is a different character in his particular presidential drama. How do you guys expect to go at this, or how have you been going at that aspect of the prep? Bob playing this role and bringing this current Trump much more to life than the Trump we saw in 2020, for example.
Listen, a couple of things. Number one, Donald Trump knows he's not playing to a MAGA rally. He knows he's going to be playing to a general election audience for, frankly, the first time in this campaign so far. But the issue for Donald Trump is not going to be his demeanor on the debate stage. The problem for Donald Trump is going to be everything that actually comes out of his mouth, because we've seen since he lost the 2020 election and snapped, he's become even more unhinged, more extreme. The things that he is talking about doing are even wilder and more extreme than what we saw when he last held power. And so we know what he's going to talk about on the debate stage. We know he's going to talk about his failed economic approach. We know he's going to talk about the abortion bans in the states that he thinks are playing out brilliantly. We know he's going to spew all kinds of nonsense. And so for this campaign, that's the contrast that we're going to present between the president, who leads with competence, with dignity, with decency, bringing people together to actually solve problems, against Donald Trump, whose unhinged behavior, whose extreme vision for where he wants to take this country is completely out of step with the voters that are going to decide this election. So all we have to do is present that contrast.
Michael, up until now, you've had Donald Trump and his opponents trying to portray President Biden as a senile old man who's barely going to be able to stand on the debate stage for the entirety of the debate. And in the last week or so, we have seen them really try to shift expectations, even going so far as to suggest that the current president of the United States might be on performance-enhancing drugs because they're concerned that when their audience has been led to believe that he is, in fact, all of the things I just referenced shows up and is the Joe Biden we saw at the State of the Union, that, you know, they're going to fritz out. And so I wonder what you make of this sort of resetting of expectations in the lead up to this debate.
Yeah, I mean, what I make of it is that Trump and his campaign know they have absolutely nothing to offer the American people with which they would agree. So they resort to nonsense like this. This is what they tried in 2020. They also have a history of playing games with the debates, right? Like complaining about the rules, complaining about the process, then skipping out on debates. So one thing is for sure, Joe Biden is going to be in Atlanta on Thursday. We assume Donald Trump will still be there as well. But we're not focused on any of this nonsense that they're spewing. We're focused on presenting the contrast to the American people. The president is going to talk about his record of accomplishment, 15 million jobs, 800,000 manufacturing jobs, the work that he has relentlessly done to lower costs for Americans, like capping the cost of insulin at $35. And he's going to contrast that against Donald Trump, his disastrous record when he was president, and the extremism that he is promising to inflict on the American people if he's able to regain power. That is the disciplined, focused approach that this campaign and this president is going to bring to the debate stage.
So, Michael, there's a lot that goes into a presidential debate, as you well know. And, you know, a lot of it is the prep for the candidate, but it also is a decision around, OK, who speaks first, who speaks last, where do you stand on the stage? CNN reports the coin landed on the Biden campaign's pick, tails, which meant his campaign got to choose whether it wanted to select the president's podium position or the order of closing statements. Biden's campaign chose to select the right position. The right podium position. Trump's campaign then chose for the former president to deliver the last closing statement, which means Biden will go first at the conclusion of the debate. I love your strategery here. Share with us the thinking behind having Donald Trump have the last word and Joe Biden saying, I'll just stand on the right side of the stage.
Well, listen, I don't know if there's too much to read into it other than the fact that President Biden continues his winning streak against Donald Trump. 2020 election, the coin flick, and we look forward to the 2024 winning streak continuing in November. But listen, you want to talk about the debate strategy. I do think one thing that may be going slightly overlooked here as we focus on the debate stage, which obviously matters, is how the campaign is using this to engage with the Biden-Harris coalition. You mentioned it at the top, but this is a moment where an increasing slice of the electorate is going to begin to tune in to the campaign, to the presidential race. And so we see it as an opportunity for our growing grassroots army to engage directly with the people in their networks. We have folks like the vice president who's going to be traveling out across the country to kick off the week on the Dobbs anniversary. We're going to be having hundreds of events on Monday focused on the stakes for reproductive care. Tuesday and Wednesday, we're going to continue that drumbeat talking about the economy that we want to build, how we're going to preserve our democracy. But we're having almost 1,600 events across the battleground states this week so that people can actually engage in their own communities online across the airwaves to make sure that people understand the choice in this election as we head into these key summer months. So we're focused intently on the debate stage, but we're also focused on making sure that we're using this moment to engage with the voters who are going to decide this election where they are in their communities.